Okay, go ahead, Adrian.
I'm going.
Hi, I'm Brian Martin. Welcome to Mac Forensics 101. How many of you have worked with Mac Forensics yet? Anybody experienced Mac Forensics people? No? Good, then we won't be bored in this. Because it's not an advanced course, it's a basics. If you've never done Mac Forensics, we're going to cover like all of the stuff, but not in any great detail. Some of it we will, some of it we won't. But the reason I want to talk about Mac Forensics is because they're becoming much more common. 10 years ago, I don't think I ever saw a Mac in a forensics case. People had them, they were there, but we'd never see them. And now they're coming up almost every time. It's at least 50-50, and because we deal with large cases with multiple computers, we tend to see a Mac in there every time now. Don't go to sleep on me. Sorry. Have to be careful with that. Since we're seeing more of them, I wanted to make sure that you guys were getting an awareness of it in your coursework or in the conference here, because you're going to come across it. So who am I and why is it even worth your time to be here? Well, I'm a forensics guy. I've been doing this for like 35 years now. Started in the Air Force. Thank you. Your tax dollars financed my education. Well, not yours, but your parents. We've done over 400 cases. We have, I don't know how many lockers full of evidence for different clients and so on. We do have the best internship program in the world. I will pitch that out there, even though nobody from down here ever takes me up on it, because you have to come up to Allentown, Pennsylvania for it, but at least it's fun. And what we're going to talk about today will get you more up to speed on OS X so that you don't go into it cold. The first time we had to deal with the Mac, I was like, well, I use a Mac. How hard can it be? And then I dug into it, and I'm like, oh, this is hard. But it's really not that hard, and it's even easier now than it used to be, or OS 10, as Bill says. I can't read the slides from here. Oh, this is a disclaimer slide. Of course, you have to have a disclaimer, right? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a perfect. Yes, I'm not perfect. Definitely not. As you can tell, because I can't read the screen from here. But the most important thing here is that anything we talk about in the presentation, you can't, yeah, funny. You can't just run off and do stuff, right? You can't learn a little bit about this and then go do forensics in the real world. That would be a bad thing. So the first thing you have to do, of course, is get training, which is a lot of reasons why you're here, right? Is to learn something new. When it comes to the tools that we use, there is training available. A lot of entry-level forensics people or people who get into forensics by accident. For example, they work at a box shop building servers for clients, and then something happens and they're like, can you do forensics? And they're like, yes, I can. And they go to YouTube and they watch a video and they think that they can do forensics, and they end up making everybody's life miserable. So get real training. Real training typically costs money. So don't just watch YouTube, get your company to pay for training when you go out and work in the real world. Training costs different amounts depending on what it is you're training for. There's a certain software package that we don't talk about that's used heavily by government and law enforcement, and they're very proud of their software. It's very expensive. The training is expensive. I don't use it. I don't think it's necessary. There are better tools for the job, especially when it comes to Macs. Most notably up here on the screen, X-Ways, which works with everything. Do you guys cover X-Ways in any of your coursework? No? Bill, you don't teach X-Ways? Come on, man.
I don't teach forensics, I teach information assurance.
X-Ways is the cat's meow. It's one of the most powerful tools that we have to use, but it's also one of the most difficult to learn how to use properly. It's also, fortunately, the cheapest one to learn how to use properly. So get X-Ways if you're going to do forensics, learn how to use it. You can actually afford to do that on your own. It's not like the other ones where you have to cough up $5 grand or something for a training session. The other one that I like is Blacklight for Macs. They do Mac stuff, so they know Macs really well. And it also does Windows stuff. And ironically, it runs on Windows while it's doing Mac stuff, or it runs on Macs while it's doing Windows stuff. It's really slick the way they've done that. And it's easy to use. It's fairly intuitive. And they have the best timeline feature out of anything, which is why one of the reasons I like it. We take the view. Yeah, we talked about why I'm doing this. But there's a funny slide, because it's going to get us to our first story. The reason we're talking about people not doing things right and getting education and so on is we get a call the other day from a friend of mine, a business associate, who is desperate for help. He's like, can you image a Mac? And I'm like, if you don't know how to image a Mac, that may be a difficult question. But Macs have imaging built into them. So it's really not hard. It's just knowing that it's there. So he calls me up and he asks if we can image it. I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. We can do that. Send it over. So he sends us this Mac. And it's not powered on. We're going to talk about that little issue later. It's not powered on. So we pop the drive, we image the Mac. No big deal. It's built into the OS, right? You do the boot, you do the recovery disk, you do the image. It's simple. All of that's well documented on the internet. You won't have any trouble finding the steps. So we image the laptop, and then he starts asking us questions about it to do our forensics investigation. And we realize, as we're going along and working through it, that the Mac is not quite right. And so I asked him, who did stuff to this Mac? And he's like, well, we had an FBI agent working on it, former FBI agent, hung his hat out as a forensic investigator because he's FBI. He didn't know how to image a Mac. And like I said, that's the first answer on Google, how do I image a Mac? And you're done. So he had it before us for a couple weeks, and we get it. But he couldn't manage it, which I thought was hysterical. And then it gets interesting. So when he had it and he couldn't figure out how to image it, he decided to turn it on. This is a former FBI agent, somebody who's accustomed to working with evidence. And what is the first rule of digital evidence? Anybody? Yes, don't modify anything. When you turn on a Windows computer, it modifies the disk. When you turn on a Mac, it modifies the disk. All of these things happen. And we know about them because we work in forensics and we don't make these dumb mistakes. But this guy had screwed up the evidence. And I'm like, no big deal. How bad can it be? He turned it on. We're looking at weird dates and stuff. So we dig into the forensics case and I go looking for the logs, the syslogs, which are really important to who's doing what when on the system. And the problem when you turn on a Mac is that if a certain amount of time has passed, it will automatically rotate the system logs, which meant in this particular case that all of the system logs were gone. And that's sort of like key to any Mac investigation, is having those system logs, and they had rotated off because he had turned on the machine, which really ruined the case. Do not turn on the Mac and use the Mac if you get a Mac. Image the drive prior to turning it on. Always work from a copy. This is like redundant stuff that you shouldn't have to tell any forensic investigator, but just make sure you know what you're doing with this stuff and don't pull an FBI. Because when he did that and ruined the case, it meant that everything we did, all of the work that we had put into it was basically out the window, because we couldn't guarantee anything on the drive. But they were asking us to put together some other stuff, so it all worked out in the end, but it was bad for the client and bad for the perp. Well, good for the perp. The other problem that you have with OS X files is the way that it handles deleted files on disk and the way that it handles reused disk space. Unlike Windows, which traditionally lays down files in a stream, across the disk surface so that it doesn't overwrite them, which is wonderful for us because then we can go into a Windows system and go, look at all this data. We've got all of this stuff in slack space. A Mac doesn't do that. Unix doesn't do that. Linux doesn't do that. Once they free up disk space, it's free to reuse. And the algorithms are always going to use it front to back. It's not going to wait and then deallocate it and work beyond it. It's going to put something back in that spot. So you tend to have a lot more churn with the Unix and the Linux systems than you do with the Windows systems, which is another reason why it's important to get your hands on them quick and not alter them. Some fun stuff about the new file system on Apple, because this is going to be really important going forward. It has a feature called copy on write, which means that there's no stray copies of the files laying around. So if you and I have an image file of a hockey game and it's the same file, the new OS is only going to have that in one spot on the disk, which makes that spot on the disk very important. If I remove my link to the file, yours is still there, but mine's gone. There's not multiple copies. It's just one of those weird things that come up in cases. Is you go into a Windows system and there's 5 copies of the same file. You can even tell your forensics FTK software, just list the copies. I don't need to see them all. It makes going through the case easier. The biggest change in it, though, is the multiple layers of encryption, which is going to just ruin our days. Much like the iPhones. Did you guys talk about iPhones? Yeah. When you lose the keys, it's gone, which is great for bad guys, not so great for good guys. But the new file system has the whole disk encryption, has volume level encryption, and it has file encryption. And that's 3 different sets of keys. The user's not aware of most of them. They're only aware of the one key. The rest of it's handled internal in the OS, which means if you punch those keys out, it's gone. Very bad. The other fun thing that it's doing is space sharing. So if you have 2 volumes on a disk, for some reason, normally it would be 1 volume per disk, but there's nothing stopping you from making 2. It doesn't pre-allocate all of the space. So if you have a 40 gig disk and you build 2 20 gig volumes on it, or 2 20 gig systems, they're going to share the free space until it's allocated, which means I can create a file in my space and then delete it, and that data will show up in your space because it's shared space. That's a little strange. It's encrypted though, so will it matter? Only if they're not encrypting their disks. But it's just one more wrinkle in the new system that we have to be aware of. So approach each case that you're working on with a very clear set of where it is that you want to go, because that's going to determine how it is that you go through the case. The surest way to cause yourself trouble with these, especially on things like Macs, because they're complicated and potentially multi-user, is to not know what it is you're getting at. Be sure you understand the client's goals and the needs from the lawyer, or you'll get it wrong. If you can't define your end goals and put a fence around what the case is supposed to be about, you need to explain that to the lawyer, that we're heading down a rabbit hole and you're not going to enjoy the cost when it comes in. If they want to know, did the bad guys get away with HIPAA data? That's a lot different than knowing were the bad guys looking at strange images, or were the bad guys hacking and doing things. Different logs in different places, different application files, and so on. If you don't define what your end goals are for the case, you're going to tend to wander into areas and spend time in areas that you don't need to, which just increases the cost for the client. So when it actually comes to the tools that we use in our shop, we think that more is merrier. We have everything but that one piece of government software that I refuse to use. We've got FTK, we've got X-Ways, Blacklight, Parabin, and then some custom tools. It's nice to have all of that in one aspect because they all do something a little different. Everybody's got their strengths and weaknesses. It's expensive though, but it does make the cases go really fast because we have 4 different systems working on everything at the same time. And like I said before, the Blacklight timeline feature just can't be beat. along with the education about a particular tool, is knowing how to use the tools that you already have, OS tools. Has anybody here been frustrated by file searching on a Mac? No, not at all? Wow. This up here is one of the things that shows what a power user is on Mac, if you can use things like this in your searches. This is how you make the Finder window do its work right, as opposed to doing its work wrong. There's about, I don't know, 2,000 different options that you can throw in there. Lots of them. But we're not going to work from the Find window anyways, because we're command line people. The other resource that you have at your disposal is the community. Never be afraid to ask questions. And this is going to go, I don't care how much experience you have, you're going to come across stuff that doesn't make sense, that you don't know. We have a great community. Everybody helps each other out. So don't be shy. Professional certifications and so on are valuable. Some are more valuable than others. Some of them come with their own communities. For example, SANS has a great online forum. ACM, any ACM members? Association of Computing Machinery, no? Okay, the ACM is another great, man, when I went to college, everybody in comp sci or in any sort of technical field had to be in the ACM or IEEE. Anybody in IEEE? Okay, you're probably going to want, no, you don't have to be computer science to use the resource. You're slacking. Anyways, the ACM and the IEEE have their own communities, and they're great resources of information. I use the ACM, phenomenal library, phenomenal. But they tend to be a little bit behind the times because they're academics. So you have to maintain other contacts through LinkedIn, Facebook, what have you. So the interesting parts of OS X are generally broken down into a few key areas, but there's stuff scattered all throughout. You've got two main spaces that you're dealing with. You've got the system spaces and you've got the user spaces. Inside each of those, they break down further into application systems and the log areas, depending on what level you're working at, if it's installed at system level, if it's work off the user stuff. When it comes to malware, that stuff can be hidden anywhere, but if you're investigating user activity, most of what you're after is going to be in user space. The only reason to go into the system space there is if you're looking for stuff to confirm what the hardware did. Like, was the hardware in this physical area with access to these wireless networks, or was it plugged into this network? That's system stuff, not user stuff. Fun stuff to do with images and icons and thumbnails. Can you read that? Okay, good. Because again, I can't, so I have to come over here. One of the fun things that Apple does is thumbnail everything that you look at. Has anybody messed with the icon database? No? This comes up in certain cases where we deal with a lot of images. You know what I'm talking about? CP. But it also comes up in IP, intellectual property cases. Did they look at the PDF? I never looked at the PDF. Well, you've got an image of it in your cache database, so you must have looked at it, because the only way this gets populated is if you looked at something. So we spend a lot of time in here when it has anything at all to do with images, or you want to establish timelines for people. But it's all up there, right? In order to look at hidden files, is that what this one is? Jeez. Sorry, I'm blind. See if I can make this. Nope. Yes, this is turning on how to view system files. If you haven't done this on your Mac yet, you probably want to do it. It lets you poke around and do things from different areas without them being hidden. It's not the same thing on Windows, it's just Mac makes it a little different. Live demo. Good. Okay, so let's go look at the thumbnail cache. Oh, sorry, my bad. We're going to do all of the live demo stuff at the end because I have to flip the screen back and forth and it gets really freaked out. So we'll look at all of that stuff at the end. Specific tools that you can use. You're going to need something to look at SQLite databases. You're going to need something to look at images. You're going to need something to look at, sorry, brain dead. Q-lists? P-lists. The forensics tools like FTK and Blacklight have all of that built in. So if you've got one of those, you don't have to do it. But you can also go and get specific tools. That doesn't show up. Which we will, when we go through the stuff at the end. You'll see DB Browser for SQLite and plist Edit Pro, they're standalone utilities. Other interesting bits with the system and the Darwin user cache, the files table, the Cocoa WebKit that references dates. If you've looked at the date strings in OS X and wondered what the heck was going on, this is what's going on. It's from 1/1/2001. Yay, trivia. And then I think that's the most important one. Yeah. Most of the good SQL tools, I don't know about all of them, but at least Blacklight will translate that for you automatically, which is really handy. Otherwise, you got to do it yourself through a shell script. So when you approach a Mac in a case, you're first on the scene with this thing. There's two things that you have to be aware of. If it's running, don't shut it down so that you can get the memory off of it. If it's not running, don't turn it on because you'll corrupt the file system. That's really simple. There's a problem though. The new Macs don't tell you if they're running or shut down until you open it up. So when you open it, you have to have your hand ready to hit the magic sequence that keeps it from booting to take you to the recovery partition, which if it's already running won't do any harm. So you can do that and get away with it and just quick duck in there before the screen comes up. Every time they change the OS, there's new information. Files get moved around. It's kind of a drag, but it's perpetual employment. So we don't think too badly of them or Microsoft for the massive changes that they make from version to version, because it keeps us all employed. I'm working on a Windows XP case right now. And I had like totally forgotten how XP did anything. And I'm in there monkeying around in the GUI and I'm like, where is stuff? Where is everything? But thanks. Lots of OSs. So even the new stuff gets to be old. These are the recent changes in the MacBook that we just talked about. Oh, yes, my favorite. It will automatically start up when you connect it to power. Bad Mac, very bad. No indicator optional. Yes. If you're going to image one of the new MacBooks that only has the USB-C port, you have to have a docking chain of dongles that is hilarious. You have to have the one that converts it to what you want. You have to have the one to plug your disk into for making the image. You have to have another one to plug your imaging tool into, unless you're using the same disk. And then you have to have power, because that's where it gets its power. And if any of the devices in your chain need power, they have to have power too. So it can get really strange with multiple power connectors and multiple dongles just to get everything set up so that you can image the silly thing. In our shop, we tend to just take it apart and pull the drive out, the little M2 drive or whatever it is they're using. I have boxes full of dongles because all of the manufacturers of the micro laptops use different formats. It's not like you can pull out a hard drive anymore. You're pulling out chips, and in some cases you can't do that. They're soldered on or they're a permanent fixture and you can't get them off, and then you're back to the USB-C port. The command line is one of our more powerful tools because terminal never lies. Unfortunately, it's a love-hate relationship. It never lies, but it also has no memory, or very little memory. It's quicker in some cases to use than Finder. So if you're going to be monkeying about with these things, I hope you know command line. because you're going to need to. Copying an image in Finder. The other thing that you get from the command line, like I said, is that there's no memory. It doesn't make fingernails. So there's no entries in the cache database from you doing things with files there, like firing off a viewer. So if the bad guys were smart, they would do everything from the command line. But they're not, thank goodness. One of the things in the command line to look for, missing log files that are not normal system rotation, missing a bash history. Bash is the name of the shell. And then, the user IDs that are kept in Darwin. If there are more user IDs in the Darwin case than you see on the system, somebody has deleted users. That gives you another trail to go down if that's something that you're after in the case. But it's something to be aware of because it happens. That number doesn't change, and it ties into other P lists. Some sample offenses of things that we're looking at. What you'll be expected to work on with this thing is users that are lazy and not using company time wisely. So you can use system files and activity files on the Mac to document how busy they were. Or just internet browser history. User looked at a spreadsheet they shouldn't have. Documents that show up in thumbnails, again. Threatening emails in Gmail. Command line abuse. Of course, the infamous CP, industrial espionage. Fun like that. The shiftless time embezzler. The nosy user. Illicit movies. These are all things that have come up in cases that we've worked on. Mr. Bash history. Is it present? What does it tell you? The bash history is a great little piece of kit because it lists all of the things that they didn't bash, unless they edited it or deleted it, in which case it's gone. And if any time has passed on the system, it will be gone quickly. The commands that are in it, though, are in order of how they were executed, but there's no time associated with it. So while you can see that the user may have run the RM command, you can't see exactly when. Now, if there are things in there that indicate time, you may be able to put something together, but in general, it's just going to tell you what they did, not when they did it, or necessarily even where they did it. Files show up in the command line much more easily than via the Finder window. And the find command in Unix is really nice because it's faster, lets you do things. When you run find and you go looking for a bash history, if you only find one bash history, you've only got one user. If you find two bash histories, you've got two users. What's wrong with that concept, though? How many users does a computer, a Mac, usually have? Just one? Or is there another one? I know it's a little late for Socratic method, but there's two users, right? It's a Linux system, or it's a Berkeley system. So one of the users is root. Root does not use the Bourne shell by default, so there's no root bash history. It also makes anything that is done as root, you can't find out because there's no bash history. It shows up in other logs, though, syslogs, which as long as they didn't rotate out, you're fine. And then inside the forensics tool, same thing. What we're learning here from looking at the dates in this conceptually is that this file has been around since May of 2016, was last used in October of 2016, and was created, date creation, forensics, we all know this, right? Here's some fun entries from a project that we were working on with a client. We pulled up their bash history and we found out that they were poking around in EC2 instances. There's other stuff in here that identifies some things that they were doing, which we had to cover up, and the client's keys were in there. Like anything command line, if you put privileged information into your command line, you have other issues that need to be addressed in your organization, like don't do that. Keys to your Amazon web servers are kind of important, should not be in there. When we want to figure out what they're doing on the Mac, one of the things that comes up is that everybody's different. You can establish basic patterns of behavior. You can figure out generally what they did, but if you want to figure out exactly what they did, you're going to have to experiment, which means you need a Mac. You can't use a Hackintosh, you can't use a VM, you need a genuine Mac to genuinely copy what they did and create identical entries to show juries, to prove to management, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. The most solid way to establish what was done is to actually create the behavior again. And then you can point line by line through what's missing, what's not missing, what's there, and say, this is exactly what they did. But it takes time. In some cases, you don't need that. In other cases, you do. It's very useful for establishing negative proof. It's pretty much the only way to do it. Trying to figure out what wasn't done or what was done, and then claiming that it was or wasn't done requires you to prove it. And in some cases, that can be really hard, especially if it's command line stuff. So you have to look at how to tie all of these logs and p-lists together, and that's done through experimentation. Sandboxing virtual machines helps, but it doesn't necessarily get all of it, especially when you're talking about things like lid activity or system activity that is taken care of by the hardware. So we always want positive proof, but always remember that you don't conclude anything. Conclusions are for lawyers. It's just basic forensic stuff from work. Negative proof. When your suspicions lead you to a dead end, you can't figure out where they did or what they did. This is where understanding how the plist system works and how the different logs in OS X work tie together so that you can go and find other evidence of what they did. There's usually at least 2 files to any activity on the system. There's some system file somewhere that's got a record of the activity. It may not have all the detail that you wish it had, but there'll be something that shows something happened. It's almost impossible to use a Mac and not leave some kind of trace. If they don't have a bash history and they don't have log files for the activities they're engaged in, they were doing something that triggered the investigation. Go look for that other something that shows there was activity at that time. Vim info is another one. Can potentially have some useful information, but only if they were using the system at a command line type level. We usually find things in here that lead us in other directions. System logs history, HIPAA survival guide, it talks about different things. It's a file full of potential evidence, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot. It just gives you directions to look in. The really useful log areas on the systems are private var audit, private var log ASL. That's the syslog area that rotates. This place right here has an extensive list of all, they try and keep it up to date, all of the different log areas. If you do Mac forensics, you'll be spending some time there. There are a plethora of logs. Anybody do Windows forensics? No? It used to be they had 3 logs on a Windows system, right? The 3 system logs. Now there's, I don't know what, a couple hundred logs. Some of them still aren't used, some of them are. Macs are like that. There's logs for almost everything. There's application logs that are kept by the system. There's application logs that are kept by the user. There's application logs that are kept by the application. So there can be multiple places to go when you're dealing with application logs. But there's logs for everything. When you start digging into the OS X system, you're going to have questions. Everybody does, because it's a very complicated thing. But you'll go looking for documentation online, and you'll become frustrated because there's not a whole lot of documentation online. There's some good work with the forensics people, but that doesn't tell you about what the actual system's doing. Here we've got the document website. Oh, that's the query that we use to pull up the documentation from Apple. This is developer documentation, though, so it tells developers what they need to know, but it doesn't necessarily tell forensics people what they need to know. But when you're trying to answer questions about what's happening on the system, why is this log active, this is another good place to find information. It's just not complete. When it comes to books on Mac forensics, much like Windows, trying to keep up with the manufacturer is a race that you're not going to win. So everything that's available in print is already out of date. It shifts too fast. You'll end up with an entire shelf of books on OS X and Mac forensics. Again, they'll all have something that is useful, so you'll have to have them all, but you may only read one chapter out of them. What all of this stuff does is help to create a mosaic of what the user did in terms of activity, as opposed to just one log. Law enforcement in particular likes to approach these things in a very binary fashion. They want to go in, find the evidence that they think they need for the case, and then stop. Because they're overworked, they're underpaid, and they have a caseload that is way too large. But when they do that, they miss certain details, which then you can come back if you're on the defense side and use to your advantage. For example, company claims that the user stole some intellectual property, looked at a PDF, and they can go to the system and find the thumbnail cache of the PDF and so on, but they stop right there. They're like, well, we've got the evidence. He looked at it at this date and time. But that doesn't tell you what else was going on or what, on the system. So you come in as defense and establish that the laptop was at Bob's house, not Billy's house, and now we've got another suspect. Now the investigation has to start back up and figure out what was happening with the laptop when it wandered over to Bob's house. Maybe nothing, but it's an example of how different pieces of the system log can fit together to give you a different picture than what's being presented to you by law enforcement or by the client initially. General methodology for testing stuff is create multiple test systems, run the test, look for time date changes. When you're doing malware analysis, anybody going to get into malware analysis? I hear it pays quite well. No? Okay. Testing is just seeing what changed, looking to see what changed, how it changed, why it changed. Here's some local user data for Safari. I have the circle in the wrong place, so I have to figure out which I'm supposed to be pointing at. This is what changed between two boots of the system. We have history DB shim. Where is it? Last session, current session 73, 117, 18. Where did it go? I can't find it now. Local storage? Local storage. Here we go. 2516 and then 2618. So we know local storage changed. What changed it, why it changed it, that's what we'd be trying to figure out. resources to read. I don't know if that's legible, but eventually the slides will be made available to you. We've got books, websites, feeds, and forums of strangeness. When you're investigating OSs, whether it's Windows or OS X or whatnot, you're going to wind up in strange places on the web. Websites with .ru, kind of like what Bill was talking about in the last section. Places that you don't want to be. So be careful when you're poking around looking for information. Not only may it not be correct information, but the website itself may be harmful. You don't need to know about pen testing. But work from a controlled environment. There's the whole concept of don't change the evidence, but you also want to avoid damaging the PC that you're working on for your case, because if that crashes, it stops the case processing, and that's a bad thing. That does happen. Where is, one of the ways that we put this is in security, you surf naked when you're doing security work. You don't want any firewalls, you don't want any antivirus, you don't want anything that's going to interfere with the packets, with the processes. If you try and send broken packets across a network, it will block you because the network does not like broken packets. So they filter that kind of stuff. Figuring out how to get to the resources that you're after can be tricky. But in the forensics world, we very much want to take care of the machines and make sure that nothing is exposed. If your test environment is compromised, everything in your case is compromised. If you don't realize that you have a rootkit on your system and a year goes by, all of the cases that you worked on are potentially arguable again. That's a bad thing. So keep them off the network. Isolate your work and leave the surfing on a Linux box that you're not afraid to trash. Okay, now let's see if I can fix the Windows. Any questions while I'm trying to get the Windows fixed? Okay. I think there's one. Oh. Okay, that's good. Now how do we get back to I don't have my monitor sharing button. That's weird. Huh. Okay. Sorry. Mac problem. Let's go to there we go. Ta-da. Okay. And we're back. Oh, but now my Mac has the same resolution as the screen, which is horrible. What are you doing? I can barely read that. Okay, so how visible is that? Oh, you guys have it nice. Not very legible, but this is the SQLite browser, DB browser for SQLite, one of the free tools that you can get your hands on. And if you can read up top here, we're looking at the thumbnail cache database and the index SQLite file, which is where all of this stuff appears. Thumbnails. Different things in here tell you different things. It's case to case what's going to be useful. But that's what the thing looks like. And then what was the other one? P-lists. P-lists generally are just not HTML. Markup language? What am I looking for? There's a word. What are P-lists? What's the format of a P-list? It's not HTML, it's the, yeah, the other one. Sorry, can't brain today. But it's a layered format. Down here at the bottom, you can see the structure. Oh, XML, duh. So all the P-lists generally will look like this. Some of them are in a different format, but a P-list viewer should be able to handle everything that you throw at it. Different bits of information depending on which P-list you're in. So here we're looking at install history, which is going to tell you what got installed when, which is kind of useful. And one of the interesting things here is that if you look at the numbers on the left, they're constantly growing. It doesn't delete anything. So if somebody installs something and then they delete it, there should still be an entry in here. It also lists things that are duplicates. For example, 75 here is QFinder Pro. And before that is the QSync client, and then there's another QFinder Pro. That's a version update. It prompted me to update QFinder Pro. I installed the new version. I got a new entry in this file. I'm going to shut these on and come back to them. Here's another fun one. Microsoft RDC Mac plist. This we were looking at this because someone was using remote desktop to do funny things, and we wanted to confirm that it was them. We were able to do so by the time signatures on this, even though we couldn't find other evidence that matched it. It's that mosaic of evidence with different log files that gives you a picture. And then the SMB server plist, another example here. There's the name of the MacBook in question. Not a big deal. Nothing. Okay. That's the SQLite. We talked about that. Quick look. Okay. All of which is available from the App Store. Here is what your Mac will look like after you turn on View Hidden Files. You get these red dots because you'll be able to see stuff now. But you can't get into it because you're not root. If you want to get into it, you go to the command line, or you run a process like this as root. VAR audit is, private VAR audit is one of the places that you're going to spend time. It's one of the key areas, but you'll access it through the command line, probably not through the Finder. Here's the thumbnail cache database again, but this time from inside Finder. You'll get to var folders. Oops, oh, wrong one. Digging down through the system here, var folders, and then here's the user directories. It's always going to have a ZZ. The ZZ in here is for root. It'll always be ZZ and never be anything else. But you'll have a random 2-character for each user, and then you'll have a random 30-character for each user. And then what we want is in C. Don't ask me what C stands for. I don't know. There's the directory, and then the index SQLite. No quick look view though. System configuration information, disk library preferences, system configuration, makes sense. A lot of these you'll find out case by case which ones you're interested in. Just go into the directories and poke around. Some of the names are really long. It will do quick look for plists. So you can glance at it and it maybe tell you if it's going to be useful or not. What window is this? No window. Here is inside of an ASL log. These are sort of binary files, but sort of not. Oh, I can make that bigger. There we go. So you can see all kinds of good stuff in here. Somewhat binary, then again, not entirely binary, so that you can go poke around with view or whatever, move through the system quicker. You can catch stuff with keyword searches. There's nothing really exciting in mine. I don't want to come back to that. Yes, close. And QL manage, another useful command to know, used for quick look managing the quick look database and testing it. Command line files, I love them. And then here is another bash history look. This one's mine. So you can see I was bouncing around the directory structure, looking at Safari library, made a copy of bash history. That would be useful if somebody made a copy of something because it would tell you where that copy went. Metadata is important, but the rest of it is just command line stuff and doesn't tell you when it was done. And that's it. Any questions at all? Okay. Thank you.